and welcome to another episode of Earth911's Sustainability in Your Ear, the podcast conversation about accelerating the transition to a sustainable carbon neutral society. I'm your host, Mitch Ratcliffe. Thank you for joining the conversation. Over the past 2 years, the United States has passed legislation that makes the largest investment in the nation's industrial competitiveness and in achieving critical environmental goals, such as lowering national emissions by 50% by 2030. It's debated whether the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which is usually referred to as the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, and the Inflation Reduction Act are sufficient to address America's climate goals, but they were a huge step in the right direction. Now, in the midst of the debt ceiling debate, the new Republican majority in the House of Representatives are seeking deep cuts in the funding for the energy transition, as well as climate justice, environmental, and workplace safety regulations, amongst others. Now, here's a bit of inside baseball. Republican Majority Leader Steve Scalise of Louisiana put a target on the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and Inflation Reduction Act when he introduced the first bill of the new Congress, House Resolution 1, the Lower Energy Costs Act. As the budget fight intensified, House Resolution 1 was passed by the House and is now part of a new, much broader bill that would cut federal spending comprehensively. It's called the Limit, Save, Grow Act of 2023, and this bill is the basis for the Republican debt ceiling strategy. We're talking today with Adrien Salazar, Policy Director for the Global Grassroots Justice Alliance, a group of more than 60 U.S. social climate and gender justice organizations, about the potential impact on environmental and pollution regulations, as well as investments in renewable energy and emissions reduction programs. The bill would make lower gas prices, not progress toward renewable alternatives, the basis of national policy. For example, it calls for unrestricted exports of U.S. oil, which would increase emissions globally, and this at a time when the remaining carbon budget for the planet would cover less than 25 years of our current emissions. If passed, the Limit, Save, Grow Act of 2023 would also repeal the $37 billion greenhouse gas reduction fund created by the Inflation Reduction Act, reverse the decision to halt the Keystone XL pipeline, and weaken pollution and emission limits while lowering protections for workers in the energy industry. The climate consequences of the bill are an important debate, and that's one that's getting lost in the overall debt ceiling coverage on cable and mainstream media. You can learn more about Adrien and the Global Grassroots Justice Alliance at ggjalliance.org, ggjalliance.org, no space, no dash, all one word. Now, let's get into this important conversation. Welcome to the show, Adrien. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me, Mitch.
Well, this is a really incredibly important conversation, as I just said. What I want to ask to begin with, because so much is going on around the Limit, Save, and Grow Act, is how would you characterize how it will change the funding for and enforcement of the climate and jobs programs, as well as the new environmental regulations in the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act?
Yeah, so it's important to just take a look at what the GOP is trying to do here. They're trying to cut funding to these massive climate care and jobs programs that were in the IIJA and the IRA. And I want to say, first of all, that the IIJA and the IRA were already compromised bills that even though Joe Biden and the Democrats are touting them, especially the large investments in climate and environmental justice as one of the landmark accomplishments of this administration, Republicans are taking a cudgel to this, and they're engaging in a war of climate denial, trying to undo those investments. And they have, as you're aware, attached a majority of their GOP energy plan, HR1, which was basically a wish list of deregulation and incentives for the fossil fuel industry, to this debt ceiling bill. And historically, we haven't seen a debt ceiling bill that has moved with conditions. And under the Trump administration, Congress raised the debt ceiling 3 times without any conditions to prevent default. And so what's happening is the Republicans are holding the country hostage for their their objectives to try to disrupt climate action, and they're trying to roll back some of the IRA's important climate provisions in order to do that.
So the Limit, Save, and Grow Act, which is such a oddly named thing in the first place, clearly describes support for expanding the burning of fossil fuels instead of cutting emissions. Can we go through a few of the key provisions of the law? So, and I want to begin with a pretty straightforward one. It ends the moratorium on new coal leasing. And given the fact that we already see a massive decline in coal use, is this basically a symbolic nod to West Virginia Senator Joe Manchin and an attempt to try to bring him over to the Republican side?
It could be read that way. And when I said that the IRA and the IIJA were already compromised bills, we know that Joe Manchin played a critical role, and the Democrats had to cater to his favor to win his vote to pass the IRA. And so this man, this coal baron senator from the state of West Virginia, has undue influence on, ironically, the climate policy, the energy policy of this country. And so we could see this moratorium and coal leasing. Joe Manchin sees his state as coal country, and I think that this is interestingly a nod from Republicans to try to bring him over to their side potentially. And what we're seeing is Manchin is actually already bolting from the Democrats. He's even criticized Biden and the administration's rollout of the IRA and threatened to vote with Republicans to repeal it. This bill that he voted for, this bill that folks negotiated with him to pass. So I can only speculate what Republicans are thinking, but they may be trying to keep their eye towards a compromise in order to win something in this Congress. I know McCarthy is trying to stake his leadership claim around the energy transition and permitting as a huge set of critical topics. And I think that they're trying to formulate their response to the energy and climate policy that the Democrats have really dug their heels into as their hallmark accomplishment in the Biden administration's first half of his term.
Are there any Republican senators that are potentially on the fence and could flip and go with the Democrats in order to get this, at least get the debt ceiling raised in the short term so that we can move forward and have another budget discussion rather than under this tight deadline?
The important thing to recognize is that this particular bill, HR 1 and the debt ceiling bill are sitting in the context of a larger fight around energy transition and particularly the question of permitting and how we address permitting energy projects and improve the permitting process to facilitate transition to a renewable energy economy. And this, on the face of it, that's a really important substantive conversation. But we are seeing through the proposals that Republicans are putting forward in these bills, actually using this debate as a front to put forward deregulatory policy. And on the Senate side, just as Joe Manchin reintroduced his version of the permitting bill, which he introduced last fall and was not successful in passing, two senators have also introduced their version of a permitting overhaul. Senator Capito has introduced the Restart Act, and Senator Barrasso has introduced the Spur Act. And it seems to me that the Republicans are trying to vie for their version of an overhaul of permitting that actually attacks bedrock environmental protections. And at the same time, some Democrats are falling into the trap of talking about the need for addressing permitting to accelerate the climate crisis. And it's making strange bedfellows for this debate.
It is interesting. It sounds like a good idea outwardly to have an online permitting system that requires review under the National Environmental Policy Act of projects of all sorts. But does that just open a back door to the approval of projects without an actual on-site inspection? Is that what the law would ultimately produce as our regulatory reality?
I have to be frank here, Mitch, in that I look at any piece of this proposal from the Republicans with very high levels of skepticism.
Mhm.
I don't think there's any good faith effort or intention to try to improve NEPA here. I think what they're trying to do is shackle or even start to dismantle this bedrock environmental law, and with the surface of trying to accelerate approvals of certain projects that they might see as beneficial. But the reality is that NEPA has protected communities and protected the ecosystems and the environment from harmful environmental impacts for decades. And it has not actually been the primary cause for delay in renewable projects. If we talk about renewable energy and the transition that we're fighting for, I think these straw man proposals are based on a misunderstanding or a deliberate twisting about the extent and sources of delay. It's not environmental protections that cause delay. It's like the inadequate funding of federal agencies that are supposed to be implementing environmental reviews. Permitting happens at every level, from the federal level to the state level to the local level, and any administrative bottleneck can cause a delay. Even a lack of projects being able to secure funding on the developer side can cause delays. It's not NEPA that is causing the majority of the delays that projects are facing. So any way that the Republicans or even the moderate Democrats are spinning, trying to reform NEPA, to me is just a front for actually trying to undo the law, which actually should be strengthened.
So there's an example of this where they literally have taken something that many environmentalists and many Americans believe is bad for us and have been scientifically proven to be bad. It makes fracking essentially a protected activity, prohibiting the president from declaring a moratorium on fracking. Would that essentially end any meaningful regulation of the fracking industry?
It seems to be the case, right? And like I said, these proposals that the Republicans are putting forward are a laundry list of giveaways to the fossil fuel industry. And HR 1, for example, the HR 1 is the part of the debt ceiling bill that targets energy, and it would, for the most part, greenlight harmful fossil fuel and mining projects, and that would lock us into decades of dependency in oil and gas and dirty energy. So the changes that they're proposing would effectively silence communities in those places that are most impacted by extraction, and limit the ways that we as ordinary people have a say in projects and how our communities are affected by them in the places that we live, work, and play. So I do see that HR 1 is reversing the course of the environmental protections that have been hard fought and won by movements and communities for decades.
So, thinking about from your perspective as an environmental justice activist, what should be the appropriate role of the communities, particularly the directly impacted communities, in the permitting process? How should we be changing? What's a good idea?
Yeah, this is a great question, because it's not that communities are not savvy or are not engaged with developers or are always in an oppositional posture. Mm-hmm. People on the ground know how to organize, and they also, for the most part, have a vision for what they want to see in their communities. And so in order to actually facilitate a just transition of our energy system, communities should be included, and stakeholders should have engagement early and often in project review processes. And there should be an adequate amount of time given for environmental reviews. I think a lot of what you see in this proposal is shortening the length of time for NEPA reviews, for Clean Air Act and Clean Water Act reviews. And that actually doesn't allow for the process to unfold with due diligence and for environmental justice assessments that do take time to take place. And then, notwithstanding what is actually done if there are findings that are harmful to communities.
So the bill also would reinstate quarterly lease auctions for the extraction rights on federal lands and in offshore drilling locations. How would this impact coastline and rural or indigenous communities that are near those places?
Yeah, this is one of the ways that it's almost a boldface how this bill is a fossil fuel handout. And we know that oil and gas companies have been sitting on about 9,000 unused but already approved permits to drill on federal land. And still they continue to rake in record profits. And so when we look at this proposal mandating more lease auctions, it actually falls into the ways that the fossil fuel industry has a stranglehold on our political system and on our economy. And actually, even the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, mandated reinstating canceled oil and gas lease sales, which the Biden administration has been doing. This is why I said earlier that the IRA was already a compromise bill. There's actually mandated fossil fuel expansion, and there's an insidious quid pro quo in the IRA that if there are offshore wind and energy lease offerings, there must also be additional oil and gas lease sales. So taking that as where we are, you see these provisions in this bill actually trying to sell more leases for oil and gas that may not be profitable or that the industry doesn't even desire.
In some cases, they've refused to buy these leases.
Exactly. So it's a wonder why we're rolling over to hand these public lands, these places that belong to us, into the hands of fossil fuel corporations. And to your question, it puts communities at risk, right? It puts the indigenous communities that live on or near those lands and people who live in the impacted areas at risk from the impacts of those violent and dangerous extractive projects. We've seen that in disasters like the BP oil spill, how massive the impacts to marine life, to ecosystems, and to the communities that depend on them can be. And if we're saying that we're going to lock in more of that infrastructure by mandating more lease sales into the next several decades, we are effectively relegating those communities to future disaster.
We've only scratched the surface of this bill, which has expanded from about 30 pages to 288 pages in the most recent version. But I need to take a quick commercial break. We're going to be right back. And we are back to continue talking with the Global Grassroots Justice Alliance's Adrien Salazar about the debt ceiling debate and the Republican Limit, Save, Grow Act of 2023 bill that would rescind the nation's recent environmental and infrastructure investments. Adrien, one of the weird things about this bill when you read it is a lot of it is cast in terms of freedom. And we were just talking about these giveaways that even the oil industry doesn't want. On the other hand, it rescinds support for the conversion or transition of low-income communities to renewable energy. And in fact, the day that we're recording this, the HUD, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, announced about $837 million in grant funding and $4 billion in loan commitments to support the Green and Resilient Retrofit Program. And that pays owners of low-income housing and multifamily housing to go green. We would lose that. How do you characterize the use of the word freedom throughout this bill and its selective application to making things more accessible to Americans?
That is a great question. And I think the way that I read it is that it is pure propaganda on the most part from Republicans trying to spin a bill that would actually attack people's freedom to have a healthy future, a freedom to be free from pollution and to have a good life for their kids and their grandkids in the face of overwhelming climate crisis. It's ironic that they use this term to pass to try to push forward the policies that they're proposing. And I think the question is freedom for who, right? If when you look at the bill and other provisions that we've been talking about and many others, it's really freedom for polluters to pollute. It's freedom for oil and gas industry to continue its expansion, to continue raking in profits at the expense of communities who are impacted by their extraction and by the tail end of those their emissions in the climate crisis and disasters and floods and wildfires. You know, we're trying to give freedom for corporations to continue to make profits over the freedom of people to have a healthy, decent life. And so the HUD program that you just mentioned, you know, I haven't heard about it until this moment, but it's a really great example of how we can actually alternatively design policy to meet the needs of people, the basic needs of people, to be able to have good quality housing, to have access to green jobs, to be able to have a guarantee of a clean energy future for their kids and their grandkids. You know, that's the kind of freedom I think we should be fighting for.
And following up on what you were saying in the first half of the show about the fact that Democrats are also putting a lot of this in place simply by negotiating, and not in behalf of the people who would generally be associated with their constituency. Why are Democrats negotiating, and what do you think their end game is? How do you see the Democratic move to change the permitting and regulatory process playing out?
Yeah, you know, when Joe Manchin introduced his Energy and Security Independence Act in the fall, we called it for what it was. We called it Manchin's Dirty Deal. It was a litany of handouts to the fossil fuel industry. And we were able to work with many other organizations and people from the front lines of energy extraction and pollution to stop this bill from being passed. And now we see the Republicans trying to lean into their offering for how to tackle the energy transition. And yet Democrats are also saying we need permitting reform. And I keep hearing this term, and I don't think that we are getting the full truth of what is being talked about here, because it is, you know, okay, we want to see more renewable energy projects. We know that with the crisis that we're facing, we need to accelerate deployment of renewable energy at scale. But we should not sacrifice the environmental protections that are assured through laws like the National Environmental Protection Act, NEPA, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, and deregulate even for renewable energy, because then we actually open up the door for fossil fuel projects. And we see that these laws, the Republican offerings, even Joe Manchin's offerings, are actually geared towards fossil fuels. They are not talking about accelerating renewable energy transition. And so it's hard for me to see what Democrats are trying to do, but I see them falling into the trap of using the language of our opponents to try to fight for the kind of accelerated energy transition that we know we need, but not recognizing that we can do that. We can have that just energy transition while keeping intact, if not strengthening, our environmental protections.
Now, there's a couple of elements of the bill that I want to dig into briefly around both toxic and hazardous materials, so things that can explode, for instance. One of the clauses in the bill would, and this is the way they describe it, unlock domestic liquefied gas, natural gas production, LNG production. What would the impact of unlocking, in other words, deregulating LNG facilities be on the fence line communities and the other low-income communities that are often just right up against those facilities?
Right. Workers in communities who live near natural gas facilities are the same communities that have been pockmarked historically by massive fossil fuel infrastructure. When we look at places like Cancer Alley in the Gulf or across Texas, Louisiana, the places where they're trying to put more LNG facilities are the same places where the oil and gas industry has had a stronghold for generations. So these communities, the communities who already have all of the burdens of the health impacts from this pollution for generations, are the same places they want to put the expanded fossil fuel infrastructure. These are sacrifice zones, or what are called sacrifice zones for the economy of this country. And they would experience increased health risks due to the exposures of more oil and gas facilities in their communities. And so this is why it's very dangerous for us to be talking about coming back to this old all of the above energy approach. We don't have the time for that. You know, the science, the climate science says that we, in order to reverse course and bring global warming down to 1.5 degrees at the maximum, we cannot continue to dig, burn fossil fuels. We cannot afford any more fossil fuel expansion. And so on the one hand, the extraction and the pollution that comes from it is going to impact the health of communities. And on the other hand, continued fossil fuel extraction is incompatible with trying to stop the climate crisis. And the people on the front lines of extraction are also on the front lines of environmental and climate disaster, like we saw in the kinds of ways that communities in the Cancer Alley region were impacted by hurricanes like Hurricane Laura and Hurricane Harvey. It happens again and again. These facilities release the same toxic chemicals that they pollute into the water, into the air when there are disasters, and the communities suffer.
Now, another example of this same sort of giving in to the need for energy from the Republican perspective is the bill limits the available time to review hazardous waste disposal programs at what they describe as critical energy facilities, which is not entirely well defined in the bill. Mm-hmm. And it also calls for waivers of the Clean Air Act when there is and this is a quote, sudden increase in demand for or shortage of a critical energy resource. So a couple of questions. The first one, how does that limit the Environmental Protection Agency and OSHA's ability to enforce safety regulations? Will workers be protected at all in that context of an emergency?
Again, I have to say, Mitch, I'm very skeptical that there are parts of this bill that have some good intention. Mm-hmm. I see this as another attempt at trying to restrict the ability of the government, the federal government, to use existing law like the Clean Air Act, which has been working for decades, in cases where the government, whoever is in the executive branch, may arbitrarily decide that there is an increased demand for energy, there's a lack of so and so resource. We need to waive the processes required according to the Clean Air Act. And so exempting some of these places, these kinds of projects would actually undo the protective laws that regulate toxic substances that are meant to keep us healthy. And it's an overly broad interpretation that is possible here that is really dangerous.
Well, it also seems to open the door to a future president, shall we say, an authoritarian president, perhaps, overriding all regulations by declaring a shortage of oil or natural gas or coal. Is that within the scope of this bill?
That's exactly what I was saying. It's that if we take it at face value that the law would require the waiver of Clean Air Act requirements whenever there is a quote unquote sudden increase or demand for a critical energy source, that, like, who determines that? Who is going to say that this is the time that we're in the need for critical energy resources? And you could argue that it could be any time, any moment. And so this is just, to me, a place where the Republicans are trying to shoehorn in ways for industry, polluting industry, to be able to, when they have a friendly administration, request like a need for accelerating these kinds of waivers. They can say, oh, we're having a shortage of so and so, or there's this crisis going on, and we need to deploy more natural gas. We need to expand our oil extraction. We must accelerate these permits, and this is what the president has to do.
This also plays into this kind of perpetual crisis environment in which we are currently living, where the news cycle is driving all of our regulatory decisions rather than science and just good, solid reviews. There is a passage deep in the bill that I find probably the most troubling of all, because it seems to tear down the public-private wall. And that is, it allows the Departments of Agriculture and Interior to accept private funding for staff positions within the agencies under those departments. What would the implications of that be for project reviews when potentially the company asking for the review paid the salary of the person who is doing the review?
Yeah, this is one of the most egregious pieces of this bill. And like you said, this is a massive bill. So we could dig and find some nuggets of some things I'm sure would make our eyes go wide. But this piece particularly, you're absolutely right. It presents a conflict of interest for these agencies to be hiring staff that would be paid for by private funding. So ostensibly, I could be an oil and gas company and say, I want to fund several positions or a whole department in the Bureau of Land Management, one of the agencies that is responsible for permitting and decisions on fossil fuel projects. And that department, that staff's paycheck comes from my company. That poses a huge ethical risk. And already today, we know that the fossil fuel industry spends tens of millions of dollars lobbying elected officials. They have teams of lawyers trying to navigate the legal system to find every kind of runaround to get their projects moving forward, to avoid engaging with communities and hearing what they're actually supposed to be doing according to the law. What would it mean if they actually had staff? That these companies would be staffing agencies up in order to move those projects forward.
And all in the context of let's accelerate the permitting process. It's always brought back to let's make business happen faster. And we have to keep this clearly in mind. So if the bill passes, and fingers crossed that it does not, at least anywhere near the current state, do states have the recourse to pass their own laws, which would be at least a countermeasure to what we would be living with?
I'm not a lawyer, but I understand that federal law, for the most part, preempts state law. And so this is why this proposal is very dangerous, because it could potentially obviate the ability of states to put in place more restrictive measures. And in that case, right, we being communities on the ground, I represent an organization that is a network of grassroots community-based groups. We would still be organizing under the legal conditions that we're facing. There are many avenues to try to continue to stop projects and to make sure communities are engaged, that people are doing right now with a very imperfect legal system. That can include engaging in the permitting processes at the state and local level, with meeting with agencies. That can include protests. That can include what we saw in Standing Rock with and Keystone XL and Dakota Access Pipeline. So there's many tactics that folks can engage, but I think what we see is this proposal and the other proposals that Republicans are putting forward really threaten the legal basis for people to be able to protect themselves from dangerous projects.
So what is the current status of the bill? I know things are changing very fast, and by the time this releases, the debt ceiling debate may have progressed. So If, for instance, we back away from the cliff and decide to fund the government for the remainder of the year, are the Republicans set up for a successful budget debate in the fall when we actually turn to what we're going to spend next?
Yeah, unfortunately, I think that what we're going to see is this set of issues keep coming up. The Republicans are making permitting and energy one of their benchmark issues for this Congress. And the Democrats are also trying to gun for some sort of permitting proposal. And fortunately, what we've heard from Senator Schumer is H.R. 1 is dead on arrival. The Republicans have put it in the debt ceiling. As you say, we'll see what happens, right, in the middle of the negotiations. But I do see that there is momentum for something to happen around this suite of issues. In fact, just these recent weeks, the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee and the Environment and Natural Resources Committee have been having hearings on permitting and how do we tackle some of these issues. So it's my worry is that we see a dangerous deal cut between Republicans and the Democrats who are just itching to pass one more climate bill. And we've even heard President Biden say that he supports Manchin's proposal. And we have heard his advisor, John Podesta, say that compromise is going to be needed to get something done on permitting. So we may see continued negotiations for a bipartisan effort, but I'm very concerned that what Republicans are doing is setting the parameters of this debate with their dangerous proposals that are trying to attack and undo bedrock environmental legislation. And we need to organize to put forward a positive vision of what energy transition looks like that is just and equitable and invest in the communities and make sure that people are engaged in these important decisions as an alternative.
What can our listeners do today to influence this debate? And is the Global Grassroots Justice Alliance organizing any activities that they could participate in?
Thanks for asking that, Mitch. So this is a very live debate right now. My organization, Grassroots Global Justice Alliance, is part of a national coalition called the Green New Deal Network that is actively trying to get people to call their members of Congress about this issue. So people who are listening can call their representatives and tell them not to support the Republicans' hostile debt ceiling package and oppose any legislation that rolls back bedrock environmental protections for people and communities. I can offer a website where people can reach directly to their member of Congress. If you go to ppls.ac/debt ceiling, that's P as in people, ppls.ac/debt ceiling. You'll get taken to a call tool where you can call your member of Congress and senators and tell them to make sure that the government's bills are paid, but keep our public programs in place and not roll back any of the benefits that are supposed to be guaranteed to people by existing law.
You know, we've had Maya Van Rossum, who is leading the Green Amendments movement, which would put into the Constitution, and several states have already adopted this, a right to a clean environment. Is that something that we should be thinking about doing at the national level now?
Oh, absolutely. I think that there are some of these innovative legal instruments that people are talking about to tackle not just ensuring a healthy environment, but stopping the acceleration of the climate crisis. You know, you mentioned a right to a clean and healthy environment. This is actually in the international level already been moved forward at the UN with a resolution that has named a right to a clean, healthy environment as a human right. That resolution passed this year. And we're also seeing at the international level tools like a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty that Pacific Island states like Vanuatu are leading on trying to advance. And there are many places where we can actually take those instruments and try to pass them at the local level. I know the state of California, there are people organizing there to try to get them to sign a commitment to a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty. And so any of these proposals, like you mentioned, if we organize states to pass a right to a clean and healthy environment and then try to put forward some federal legislation, I think that is what we should be fighting for, is how do we actually strengthen the decades of environmental protections that we have won because movements have organized and people have said that we need to protect our health and we need to protect our environment for future generations.
Adrien, thank you so much for spending time with us today. It's been really informative.
Thank you so much, Mitch. I really appreciate the time. And this was a great conversation. Thank you.
We've been speaking with Adrien Salazar. He is the policy director for the Global Grassroots Justice Alliance. And you can learn more about the organization and get involved at ggjalliance.org. GGJ Alliance is all one word, no space, no dash, ggjalliance.org. The nation made the decision in the last couple of years to invest in its future. Now, when the bills are starting to come due, we're threatening not to pay those bills. This is no way to run a country, and it is time to clearly separate the budget negotiations from raising the debt ceiling so that policy, even controversial policies, can be debated on their own merits. The Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and Inflation Reduction Act can be addressed when the nation is not threatened with default, which would raise the cost of living for all and topple the dollar's global economic primacy. Even if you don't agree with how we spend our tax dollars, most of us would agree that becoming a deadbeat country is bad for business and amplifies economic inequality. Several of the issues that Adrien discussed, including the shocking breach of the barrier between public and private funding of regulatory reviews, represent systematic changes to our democracy. It's ironic that the states' rights Republicans are passing national policy about energy that can override states' abilities to set their own standards for energy exploration and community safety. We need the 50 laboratories of democracy that we've created to be allowed to work. And so we'll continue to monitor the situation and talk with guests on the show about U.S. environmental policy and the green infrastructure. Stay tuned. I hope you'll take a moment to share this podcast or any of the more than 390 other interviews we produced on sustainability in your ear with your friends, family, your coworkers. Let's get everyone talking. Writing a review on your favorite podcast platform will help get your neighbors to this show. And you folks are the amplifiers that spread more ideas so we can create less waste. Please tell everyone that you can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Audible, or any of the other fine purveyors of podcast goodness that you prefer. Thank you so much for your support, folks. I'm Mitch Ratcliffe. This is Earth911, and we will be back with another Innovator interview soon. In the meantime, take care of yourself, take care of one another, and let's all take care of this beautiful planet of ours, including this country of ours. Have a green day.